I'm a man, and the reason I knew something was wrong almost the second I got there had nothing to do with the house itself and everything to do with the way people were speaking to me before I even understood what they thought I had already agreed to. I had only just walked in. I was still in that awkward first minute where you are taking in who is there, figuring out where to put your keys, saying hello in that half-distracted way people do when they are arriving late to something they assume has already started without them. One of the men there came over and shook my hand, and he thanked me in the kind of warm, relieved tone people use when they think you have done something generous for someone they care about. Before I could even really respond to that, another one smiled and said it was good my sister and her husband had family they could rely on when things got tight. For a second, I honestly thought I had missed part of a conversation, or maybe forgotten something vague I had said in passing, and somebody had taken more seriously than I meant it. That can happen in families, especially when money is involved, because people hear what they need to hear and then later repeat it back like it was a settled plan all along. Then one of them said my sister had already explained that I was covering the deposit so they could move ahead, and that was the exact moment where the whole thing stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like I had walked into the middle of a decision that had been made somewhere else. I remember asking him what deposit he was talking about, and he looked at me like I was either joking or pretending not to know. He said it was for the house, like that should have been enough to make everything obvious. When I did not say anything right away, he added that my sister had spoken to them earlier in the week and told them not to worry because I was helping. He was not trying to be manipulative. That was the strange part. He sounded relaxed, normal, even grateful. To him, this was already settled. He thought he was thanking the right person for doing the right thing. The problem was that I had no idea what he was talking about, and once I realized that, that heavy feeling hit me almost immediately, because there are certain situations where you know before you even ask the next question that you are about to find out somebody has already been using your name as if your answer belonged to them. I asked him who exactly had told him that, even though I already knew the answer before he said it. He pointed toward the kitchen and said my sister had spoken to them and explained everything. What bothered me about that was that there was already a version of events moving around the room, and somehow I was the last person hearing it. I went straight to the kitchen after that. I could hear her before I saw her, and what struck me even then was how normal she sounded. There was no tension in her voice, no hesitation, no edge of guilt, nothing in her tone that suggested she was worried about whether I would back up what she had already been saying. She sounded like somebody talking through details after the big issue had already been settled. When I stepped in and she saw me, she smiled and said, "There you are," in this easy, casual way that instantly annoyed me, because it carried the energy of someone who thought I had arrived to confirm something, not someone who had just walked blind into a situation with his name already attached to it. I asked her what she had told them, and she did not even bother pretending not to understand what I meant. She just said she had told them I was helping with the deposit and that it was fine because she had already explained it. That was the first moment where I felt that very specific kind of anger that has less to do with volume and more to do with the fact that somebody is acting as if the line they crossed is so obviously acceptable that they do not even feel the need to defend it properly. She was not asking me whether I was okay with what she had said. She was not checking whether there had been some mistake. She was speaking like the real conversation had already happened, and I was now being informed of the outcome. So I asked her, as plainly as I could, when exactly I had agreed to cover any deposit. She answered the way people answer when they know they are standing on weak ground, but still think confidence might get them across it. She said we had already talked about it. The problem with that was simple. We had not. A couple of weeks earlier, she had mentioned that things were tight, that they were trying to move quickly if the house worked out, and that timing was going to matter if they wanted to secure it. I remember telling her something general, something open-ended, something along the lines of seeing what I could do if things got bad. That was all. It was not a promise, it was not a commitment, and it was definitely not me agreeing to cover a deposit so they could move ahead. It was the kind of sentence people say when they are trying to sound supportive without knowing yet what is actually being asked of them. That is a very different thing from agreeing to a specific sum of money in a specific situation, and she knew that perfectly well. I told her that was not what I had said, and the second I said it, she lowered her voice and told me not to do this right now. That was when the whole shape of the thing became clear. Up until then, there was still a tiny part of me that wondered whether she had said something sloppy and not realized how it would land once it got repeated. The moment she told me not to do this right now, that possibility died. She knew exactly what she had done. She knew it would sound bad if I said it clearly. She just did not want that happening while the people she had already spoken to were still in the other room. I told her she had no right to tell people I was paying for something before even asking me first. I did not say it loudly, because I still had one foot in that instinct a lot of people have when family is involved, that instinct to keep a lid on things, to avoid making the room turn all at once and realize something is wrong. But even saying it quietly, I knew it was true enough that she had no real answer to it. What she said instead was, "I knew you'd help." That was her whole defense. Not that she had misunderstood me. Not that she should have checked first. Not that she had got ahead of herself and handled it badly. Just that she knew I would help. As if deciding what I was going to say before I said it was somehow acceptable because the answer she wanted felt likely enough in her head. I remember looking past her into the living room after that and suddenly seeing the whole setup differently. The people out there were not waiting for a discussion to happen. They were waiting for me to confirm what had already been sold to them as settled. They were relaxed in that specific way people get when they think the hard part is over and all that remains is the formal step. That was the part that really changed how I felt about it. If she had asked me privately, that would have been one thing. I might still have said no. I might have said yes under certain terms. I might have offered less than what she wanted. Whatever the answer was, at least it would have been mine. But this was not that. This was her putting me in a position where saying no would not just be me refusing a request. It would be me disrupting a room full of people who already believed the request had been accepted. So I asked her again, slower this time, why she would tell them that before talking to me first. She got irritated in that compressed, controlled way people do when they think they should not have to explain themselves because they still believe the bigger practical problem matters more than the line they crossed. She said there was not time to go back and forth on every detail, and if she waited to discuss everything properly, nothing would ever get done. I told her this was not some tiny detail lost in the paperwork. This was a decision involving my money and my name, and there was no world where that counted as a minor part of the process. She said I was making it bigger than it needed to be, which is exactly the kind of thing people say when they need your reaction to look exaggerated so their own behavior feels more normal by comparison. That was the point where the whole thing stopped being mainly about the deposit in my head. Obviously, the money mattered. I am not pretending it did not. But what got me faster was that she had already decided what my answer was supposed to be and built the whole situation around the idea that once enough people were involved, I would be too uncomfortable to push back. That was what she had done. She had set the pressure first and planned to deal with my actual answer later. Standing there in the kitchen, hearing the easy noise from the other room and looking at her face while she waited for me to stop pushing, I already knew this was not going to stay small. There was no clean version left. Either I went along with what she had said and let everyone continue believing this had been my decision all along, or I said what was actually true and changed the whole atmosphere in the house right there and then. I kept my voice low, not because I was trying to protect her, but because I didn't want to turn the whole room at once before I was sure what I was going to say. At that point, I was already angry, but it wasn't the kind of anger that makes you raise your voice. It was the kind that makes everything feel very clear, very direct, like there's no point pretending anything is smaller than it actually is. She kept talking like the real problem was timing, not what she had done. She said they were close to locking the place in, that things were already moving, and that there wasn't room to slow everything down just to go over details that were, in her words, basically already understood. That phrasing stuck with me, because nothing about it had been understood by me, and yet she was speaking like the understanding itself mattered more than whether it was real. I told her again that this wasn't about details, and it wasn't about timing. It was about the fact that she had already told people I agreed to something I had not agreed to, and now she was acting like the only issue left was how I chose to handle that in front of others. She shook her head like I was missing the point and said I was focusing on the wrong thing. According to her, the important part was that they needed help right now, that they were already under pressure, and that there was no reason to complicate things when the solution was already there. The way she said the solution made it sound like my involvement was just a piece of a plan she had already finished building. I asked her, very directly, if she had ever actually asked me if I would cover the deposit. She didn't answer immediately, and that pause told me everything before she even spoke again. When she did answer, she didn't say yes or no. She said she knew I would help. That was it. She kept coming back to that, like it was supposed to erase the step she skipped. Like certainty in her own head was enough to replace an actual conversation. I told her that knowing what you think someone will say is not the same thing as asking them, especially when the thing you are deciding for them involves money and other people are already being told it's handled. She didn't argue with that directly. Instead, she moved back to the part she cared about, which was what happens now. She said people were already waiting, that everything had been discussed, and that there was no reason to turn it into something uncomfortable when we could just move forward and talk about it later. She kept repeating that idea in slightly different ways, like if she said later enough times it would somehow make the present situation less real. I told her that later doesn't mean anything once you've already told people something is done. At that point, later just means after I've already been pushed into confirming it. That was when she said it. She leaned in a little closer, lowered her voice even more, and told me not to embarrass her. She didn't say it loudly or dramatically. She said it like it was obvious, like it was the one thing that should matter to me in that moment. And that's when it all lined up properly. Up until then, there was still a part of me that was trying to see if she just handled it badly, if she rushed it, if she got ahead of herself. When she said that, it became clear that the real issue for her was not whether I had agreed. The real issue was that she had already said it out loud to other people, and now she didn't want to deal with what happens if I don't back her up. I asked her if she actually hears what she's saying. I told her she already told people I would pay before even asking me, and now she's worried about being embarrassed if I don't go along with it. She got annoyed and said I knew exactly what she meant, and that there was no reason to make everything worse than it needed to be. That phrase came up again, making things worse, like the damage was something I might cause, not something that had already been done. She said we could figure it out between us afterward, that there was no point dragging everyone else into it, and that I was creating a problem that didn't have to exist if I just handled it properly. I asked her what handling it properly meant, and she didn't say it directly, but it was obvious. It meant agreeing now and arguing later. It meant protecting what she had already said, even if it wasn't true, and sorting out the consequences afterward in private. I told her I wasn't going to pretend I agreed to something just because she already told people I did. She looked at me for a second, really looked this time, like she was finally trying to decide whether I was serious or just pushing back out of frustration. Then she asked if I was actually going to walk into the living room and say no. I told her I was going to say what was true. That changed something in her expression. Up until then, she still had that calm confidence, like she believed she could steer the conversation back where she wanted it. When I said that, that confidence slipped, not completely, but enough that you could see she was starting to understand she might not be able to control how this plays out. So she tried a different angle. She said she only did this because she knew I cared, because she knew I wouldn't want them to lose the house over something like this, and because she thought I would help anyway. She said it like she was appealing to something reasonable, like she was trying to remind me of the kind of person I am supposed to be. What she was really doing was trying to turn it into a choice where I either help and prove I care, or refuse and look like I'm making a point just to make one. I told her that's not what this is. I told her if I offer help, that's one thing, but if she volunteers me without asking, that's something else entirely, and those two things don't become the same just because she wants them to. She kept saying I would have helped anyway, so I asked her how she knew that. She said because she knows me. That answer might have worked if we were talking about something small, something that doesn't carry weight, but here it just sounded like she was trying to replace an actual decision with her own assumption. I told her knowing me doesn't give her the right to decide for me, and definitely doesn't give her the right to tell other people I already said yes. She didn't like that. She called me difficult, said I was making things harder than they needed to be, said normal people don't break things down like this when family needs help. Then she went through the usual points, that I'm in a better position, that they're under pressure, that this is exactly when family is supposed to step up. I let her say all of that, because none of it actually answered the one thing that mattered. The more she talked, the clearer it became that if I went along with this now, it wouldn't just be about helping them once. It would be about confirming that this way of doing things works, that she can speak for me first and deal with my reaction later. Because once enough people are involved, I'll choose the easier option just to avoid the situation getting uncomfortable. That's the part that settled it for me. So I asked her something simple, something she couldn't move around. If she was so sure I would say yes, then why didn't she ask me first? She didn't have a real answer to that. She said things were moving fast, people needed an answer, and she didn't want to slow everything down over a conversation she thought was unnecessary. That was the closest she got to saying the truth out loud. She thought asking me was unnecessary. She didn't phrase it like that, but that's what it was. In her head, the outcome mattered more than whether I had actually agreed to it. I told her I'm not going to back something just because she already said it confidently. She glanced toward the living room again and then back at me, and this time I could see something different in her face. Not just irritation, but the start of that realization that the version of the day she planned might not hold together. Then she said, "Just don't do this in front of them." And the moment she said that, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I didn't say anything else to her after that, because by then there wasn't really anything left to say in private. She understood what she had done. I understood that she understood it, and the only thing she still wanted was for me to help her keep the whole thing from becoming public. Once I realized that, the kitchen stopped feeling like the place where the problem could still be solved. It just felt like the place where she was trying to delay the moment the rest of the room caught up. So I walked back into the living room. The second I stepped in, I could feel that slight pause people make when they've been waiting for something to move forward and they're trying to work out whether it finally will. Nobody looked alarmed yet. Nobody had that expression people get when they know a situation has gone wrong. At that point, they were still just expecting the normal continuation of a normal conversation. My sister came in right behind me, close enough that it was obvious she still thought she might be able to steer it if she moved fast enough. One of the men smiled at me and said it was good we were all on the same page now. And that was probably the worst possible sentence he could have used, because it made it impossible for me to pretend this was still vague or recoverable or something that only existed between me and her. Everyone in that room had already been given a clean version of what was happening. The page was already written. The only question was whether I was going to sign my name to it, because it would be easier than stopping the whole thing. I said I needed to clear something up before this went any further. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't put any drama into it, but that was enough. The room shifted almost immediately. People stopped moving the way they had been moving. The conversation that had been running underneath everything thinned out and then disappeared. You can feel that happen sometimes before anyone says anything else, that small collective adjustment when a room realizes it may have been reading the situation wrong. I said there had been a misunderstanding and that I had never agreed to cover any deposit. There was a second, maybe two, where nobody said anything at all. One of them looked at my sister straight away. Another looked back at me with that blank, slightly delayed expression people get when they're still trying to decide whether they heard something minor or something important. The atmosphere didn't explode. It went careful. That was almost worse, because the careful silence made it obvious people understood enough to know they didn't want to rush in without knowing where they stood. My sister stepped in quickly and said it wasn't really a misunderstanding, that we had already talked about it, and I was just getting hung up on wording. She said it in that tight, controlled tone people use when they know they're losing grip on a situation but don't want anyone else to hear panic in their voice. She was trying to drag it back into the version where this was a small dispute over phrasing, not the much uglier version where she had volunteered my money before even asking me. I told her it wasn't wording, and I said that as plainly as I could. I said if she wanted help from me, that was one conversation. Telling people I was paying before speaking to me was another conversation entirely, and the fact that she kept trying to blur those into one was exactly the problem. That was when the embarrassment she had been worried about finally arrived. Nobody got loud. Nobody interrupted with fake reassurance. If anything, the room became even more polite, which is what people do when they've suddenly realized they are in the middle of something personal and they want to get out of it without looking as if they were part of the pressure that created it. One of the people there said maybe this wasn't the best time to keep pushing the conversation and that things could be revisited later. Another said he honestly thought everything was already agreed. The man who had thanked me when I came in looked like he wished he hadn't said anything at all. My sister kept trying to push past the actual issue. She said we were family, that this was getting blown out of proportion, and that there was no reason to make everyone else uncomfortable over something that should have stayed between us. That last part said more than she meant it to, because it quietly admitted what she still would not say directly, which was that it should have stayed between us before she decided to tell other people about it. So I asked her, right there in front of everyone, whether she had ever actually asked me if I would cover the deposit. She didn't answer straight away, and that pause did a lot more damage to her position than anything I could have said for her. You could see it land on people's faces in slightly different ways. Nobody looked shocked, exactly. It was more that look of recognition people get when the tidy version of a story they were given starts to fall apart, and suddenly they can see the shape of what was missing from it. She finally said she knew I was going to help anyway, and that she had only been trying to move things forward because everyone was already under enough pressure. I told her deciding what I was going to do with my money and then announcing it to other people was not moving things forward. I told her that was making a promise for me because she didn't want to risk hearing no in private. Once I said that, there wasn't much room left for her to keep pretending this was small. She could still be angry, she could still defend herself, but she couldn't really hide inside vague language anymore. That was the point where she got properly angry. She asked if I was really willing to let everything fall apart over this. That question told me a lot, because it made her thinking completely obvious. In her head, the only thing that counted as everything was the arrangement she wanted, the house, the deposit, the version of the day where people leave feeling reassured and things keep moving. The fact that she had put me in the middle of it without my consent did not seem to register as the thing that had already made everything unstable. She was still talking like the danger started with my refusal rather than with her decision to speak for me. I told her I was not the one who built everything on a promise that didn't exist. Her husband spoke for the first time in any meaningful way then. Up to that point, he had mostly stood a little to one side with that expression people wear when they know something is going bad, but still hope they can stay outside of it. He said maybe everyone needed a minute to calm down, which irritated me more than I expected, not because he was trying to make peace, but because calm down is one of those phrases people reach for when they want your reaction to become the issue instead of the thing that caused it. I was calm. I had been calm the whole time. Calm was not the problem. So I told him I was calm, and I told him that the problem was very simple. I had not agreed to pay the deposit, and I was not going to stand there and pretend that I had just because pretending would make the room more comfortable. After that, the people who had been there for the house began backing away from the whole thing without literally leaving yet. You could see it happen. The energy changed from, let's finish this, to, we need to get out of this without making it worse. One of them said it probably made sense to pause and revisit things when everything was actually decided. That phrase stuck with me immediately because it was probably the most honest phrase anyone in the room besides me had said all afternoon. Actually decided. Not assumed. Not moved along. Not understood. Decided. My sister looked like she still wanted to fight, but now she had a problem she couldn't solve with confidence anymore. If she kept pushing, she would have to say the ugly part clearly. She would have to admit that she had acted first because she did not want to hear my actual answer before she set the rest of the situation in motion. And that was the one thing she still wasn't willing to say. So instead, she went back to emotion. She said she couldn't believe I was doing this to her in front of everyone, and that if I had any decency at all, I would have kept it between us. I told her she had the chance to keep it between us before she told them. That landed exactly the way it should have, because there was nothing she could really do with it. She could be offended by it, but she couldn't honestly argue with it without making herself look worse. I picked up my keys and told them all I was leaving. I said if they wanted help from me, they could ask me directly like adults, but I wasn't discussing anything else that day, and I wasn't paying a deposit I had never agreed to cover. I kept my tone flat on purpose, because by then there was nothing to gain from sounding emotional. The truth was already doing enough. Then I left. Nobody followed me out immediately, which told me the room was still busy absorbing what had just happened. The last thing I heard before I shut the door was my sister starting to explain herself again, but the confidence had gone out of her voice by then. She no longer sounded like someone managing a plan. She sounded like someone trying to rebuild a version of the room that had already collapsed. By the time I got to my car, I was still angry, but I wasn't doubting myself at all. More than anything, I felt clear about what she had done and why it got to me so fast. Once somebody starts using your answer before you've actually given it, the problem is not just the favor anymore. It is the fact that they thought they could decide for you first and deal with you afterward. By the time I got to the car, I didn't leave right away. I just sat there for a minute with my hands still on the steering wheel, replaying the whole thing in my head, not in the dramatic way people imagine, but in that quiet, methodical way where you go back over what was actually said and what was actually done, just to make sure you didn't miss something that would change how you see it. I checked my phone without really thinking about it, and there were already missed calls from my sister. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how quickly the situation had shifted from her being confident enough to speak for me in front of other people to her needing to get control of the conversation again as soon as I stepped out of the room. It was the same pattern, just in reverse. First, she moved without asking me because she thought she could manage the outcome later, and now she was trying to reach me because the outcome didn't go the way she expected. I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in continuing the same conversation again, just in a different location. A few minutes later, messages started coming through. The first ones were exactly what I expected. She asked what I was doing, why I handled it like that, why I couldn't just talk to her instead of saying everything in front of everyone. There was nothing in those messages about what she had done, not even a line acknowledging it. The focus was completely on how I reacted and how that reaction made things harder for her. I read them once, then locked the phone and put it down. I didn't feel any urgency to respond, because I already knew what the conversation would look like if I did. It would go in circles. She would keep trying to shrink what she had done and expand what I had done, and somewhere in the middle she would try to turn it into a question of attitude instead of a question of responsibility. I started the car and drove home. On the way back, I kept thinking about how easy it had been for her to skip asking me. Not just that she did it, but how natural it seemed to her. There was no hesitation in her voice when she told those people I was covering the deposit. There was no sign she expected pushback. That part bothered me more than the money itself, because it meant this wasn't a one-off mistake where she got carried away. It meant she genuinely believed she could decide something like that first and deal with my reaction later. By the time I got home, there were more messages waiting. One of them was longer. She said I embarrassed her, that I made the situation uncomfortable for everyone, and that I left her there to deal with the fallout alone. Again, nothing about her telling people I agreed before asking me. Nothing about the fact that I actually did try to talk to her privately before saying anything in the living room. It was all framed around the idea that the real problem started when I didn't play along. I started typing a reply at one point. I wrote out a couple of lines explaining, again, that I had spoken to her first, and that she gave me no real option once she had already told everyone I agreed. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then deleted it. There was no point sending something she wasn't ready to hear. It would just turn into another back and forth where we both repeat the same positions in slightly different words. Not long after that, her husband called. I let it ring out. It wasn't that I had anything personal against him in that moment. It was just that he had stood there while all of this was happening and didn't step in until the situation had already started to fall apart. And even then his version of stepping in was telling everyone to calm down instead of addressing what actually caused the problem. I didn't see any reason to go through the same conversation again with him acting like a middleman. A little while later, I got a message from one of the people involved with the house. It was polite, almost overly polite, the kind of message people send when they want to distance themselves from something without sounding like they are taking sides. He said he understood if there had been some confusion and that they just wanted clarity moving forward so nobody was left uncertain about where things stood. That message said more than anything else had up to that point, because it showed me exactly how the situation looked from the outside. To them, this wasn't just a disagreement between me and my sister. It was a deal that had been presented as done and then suddenly wasn't. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to realize something about the way it had been handled wasn't solid. I replied to him briefly. I told him there had been a misunderstanding and that I hadn't agreed to cover any deposit, and that was all I said. I didn't go into detail because he didn't need it, and I didn't want to drag him further into something that was clearly a family issue. After that, things were quiet for a bit. Then my mother called. I knew what that call was going to be about before I even picked up. In situations like this, the conversation usually shifts pretty quickly from what happened to how it should have been handled, and most of the time that shift is not in your favor if you are the one who refused to go along with something. I answered anyway. She started gently, which is how she always starts when she already has a position but wants to ease into it. She said my sister was under a lot of pressure, that things had been stressful for them, and that I didn't have to correct her like that in front of everyone. I told her I didn't correct her in front of everyone first. I told her I spoke to her in the kitchen, privately, and explained exactly what the problem was. I said the only reason it moved into the living room was because she had already told everyone something that wasn't true. There was a pause after that, but not the kind that means someone is reconsidering. It was the kind that means they are adjusting how they are going to say the same point in a different way. She said maybe my sister assumed I would help, and that sometimes people make those assumptions when they feel supported. I told her assuming is not the same thing as asking, especially when money is involved, and especially when other people are already being told it's handled. She said family situations are not always that simple, and that sometimes you have to be flexible when people are under pressure. I asked her something very direct. I asked her how she would feel if someone told other people she had agreed to pay for something without asking her first, and then expected her to go along with it so things didn't become awkward. She didn't answer that directly. She said it was different. It always is, when it's not happening to you. We went back and forth for a few more minutes, but nothing really changed. She stayed on the side of keeping things smooth, avoiding embarrassment, understanding pressure. I stayed on the side of the actual sequence of events, what was said, what wasn't said, and what that means when you strip away all the softer language people use to avoid saying someone crossed a line. Eventually, the conversation just ran out. Not resolved, just finished. Later that evening, my sister sent another message. This one was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't emotional in the same way. It didn't talk about embarrassment or how I handled things. It was short and direct. She asked if I was helping or not because they were running out of time and needed to know what they were dealing with. Reading that, I realized something had shifted for her too. Earlier, she was focused on how things looked and how I made her feel in front of others. Now she was focused on the result again. The question had come back to what she wanted from the start, just without the confidence that it was already guaranteed. I didn't answer right away. I left the message there for a while and did something else, just to make sure I wasn't replying out of the leftover frustration from earlier. When I finally came back to it, the situation felt very simple. If she had asked me before telling anyone else, we could have had a normal conversation about it. Maybe I would have helped, maybe I wouldn't, but at least the decision would have been mine to make without pressure. But after everything that had happened, helping now would mean confirming that the way she handled it was acceptable. It would mean showing her that she could skip the part where she asks me and still end up with the same result as long as she involves enough people first. So I replied. I told her if she needed help, she should have asked me before telling anyone I agreed. And I told her that after everything that happened, I'm not involved. She didn't reply after that. No argument, no pushback, nothing. Just silence. And honestly, that silence made more sense than anything else that had been said all day, because at that point there wasn't really anything left to argue about. The situation was clear, the line had been crossed, and whatever version of things she had tried to build earlier no longer had anything holding it together. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like some big final moment. It just felt like something that had already been decided the second she chose to speak for me before I had the chance to speak for myself. The next day felt strange, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, slightly off way where you notice the absence of something more than the presence of anything new. There were no messages from her in the morning, which was unusual considering how things ended the night before. Normally, even after arguments, there would be some kind of follow-up, even if it was just a short message that kept the conversation alive. This time there was nothing. I went through my normal routine, but I caught myself checking my phone more often than I usually would, not because I was expecting an apology, but because I was trying to understand what direction this was going to take. Silence can mean a lot of things, and in situations like this, it usually means the other person is either waiting for you to come back and soften your position, or they are trying to regroup and figure out how to approach it from a different angle. Around midday, my mother sent me a message asking if I had spoken to my sister again. That alone told me they had already been talking. I replied that I hadn't, and she said maybe it would be better if I reached out first and cleared things up before it got worse. That phrase, before it got worse, stuck with me, because from my point of view, the worst part had already happened. The line had already been crossed. What they meant by worse was the distance that comes after, the tension that sits there when nobody wants to fully address what actually happened, but nobody can pretend it didn't happen either. I told her I didn't think there was anything to clear up, because everything that needed to be said had already been said the day before. She didn't push much after that, which usually means she understood I wasn't going to move easily, even if she didn't agree with me. Later that afternoon, my sister finally sent another message. It wasn't long, and it wasn't aggressive. It was more controlled than anything she had sent the day before. She said she didn't appreciate how I handled things, that I could have waited and spoken to her properly instead of putting her in that position, and that now everything was uncertain because of it. Reading it, I noticed something very specific. She still wasn't acknowledging what she did. She was still talking around it, framing the situation as something that became a problem because of how I reacted, not because of what started it. It was subtle, but it was consistent. Every version of her explanation kept the focus slightly shifted away from the original decision she made and onto how things unfolded afterward. I replied, but this time I kept it short. I told her I did speak to her properly, in private, before anything was said in front of anyone else. I told her the only reason it became public was because she had already made it public by telling people I agreed. And I told her that if she wanted things handled differently, then the first step should have been handled differently. She didn't respond straight away. A few hours passed, and then she sent another message. This one was different again. Not softer, not more understanding, just more direct. She said she didn't think what she did was as serious as I was making it, and that from her perspective, she was trying to solve a problem quickly in a situation where time mattered. That was probably the closest she got to actually describing what she had done without dressing it up too much. I read that a couple of times before replying. Then I told her that solving a problem quickly doesn't give you the right to make decisions for someone else and present them as already agreed, especially when that decision involves their money and their name. I told her if she had come to me first, we could have had a normal conversation and maybe reached a solution that worked for both of us. But once she chose to speak for me instead, the situation stopped being about helping and became about whether I was willing to accept that kind of behavior. After that, the conversation stopped again. Not completely, but it slowed down to the point where it was clear neither of us was going to shift our position in a way that would bring things back to how they were before. There was no big argument, no dramatic final message, just a gradual reduction in how much we spoke and what we spoke about. A couple of days later, I heard through my mother that they were trying to find another way to handle the deposit. She didn't go into details, and I didn't ask. At that point, I wasn't interested in the outcome of the house anymore. Whether they got it or not wasn't really my concern. What stayed with me instead was how quickly something like this changes the way you see someone. Before that day, I would have described my sister as someone who could be pushy sometimes, someone who liked to move things along and didn't always think through how her decisions affected other people. But I wouldn't have said she would go as far as deciding something like that for me and presenting it as already agreed. After that day, I couldn't really unsee it. Not because of the money itself, but because of how easily she skipped the part where my answer actually mattered. That's the kind of thing that changes how you approach future situations, because once you know someone is capable of doing that, you start paying attention to different things. You start noticing when they speak for you in small ways, when they assume your agreement instead of asking for it, when they frame things as already decided instead of open for discussion. About a week later, we ended up in the same place again for something unrelated. It wasn't planned. It just happened that we were both there at the same time. The interaction was normal on the surface. We said hello, we spoke about neutral things, nothing connected to what happened before. If someone had been watching from the outside, they probably would have said everything looked fine. But it wasn't the same. There was a gap there that hadn't been there before. Not hostility, not open tension, just a clear distance. The kind of distance where both people are aware of something that hasn't been resolved, and instead of pushing it back into the conversation, they both move around it carefully. At one point, she mentioned something about needing to sort something out in the next few weeks, and I noticed the way she said it. She didn't attach my name to it. She didn't assume anything. She spoke about it as her situation, her responsibility. It was a small thing, but it stood out immediately because it was different from how she handled things before. I didn't comment on it, and I didn't need to. The difference was already there. We didn't talk about the house again, and we didn't revisit the argument. There was no clean resolution, no moment where everything got explained properly and tied up in a way that makes both sides feel understood. What was left after that was quieter than that. It was just a change in how we dealt with each other, and an understanding, at least on my side, that helping someone and being used as the solution before you've agreed are not the same thing, no matter how much pressure there is or how urgent somebody says it is. I didn't need some huge final moment to understand that. It was already clear enough.